Hi, welcome to Strategy, Leadership, and Impact with your host, Blake Repine. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to this episode of Strategy, Leadership, and Impact. Hope you've been well since the last one. You may have noticed that the intros and outro is back. Started that last episode. I'd asked probably 4 episodes ago where the intro and outro had been taken out, whether or not people would like to see one back or hear one back. And of course, the response was that yes, people would like to hear one, but keep it short and then keep the intro or the updates and things like that at the beginning very short too. I know I listened to some podcast and the host can go on and on and on for 20, 30 minutes sometimes before they actually get into the subject, why I've actually downloaded the podcast to listen to. Try to keep the intro short. We do have an intro and outro music back in. Hope you enjoy it. If you don't, let me know. But again, the majority said yes, they would like to see that back. So without further ado, I'll get straight into this week's topic. And what I want to talk about is the psychosocial hazards that came into being within the legislation here in Australia recently, and talk about what are psychosocial hazards and how do we identify them, how do we address them, all the facets about it. But first, there's legislation across the world, and recognizing that my listeners, the majority, of course, are in Australia where I live, but there are also quite a few based in the US, the UK. India is another big area of listenership for me, but I have listeners all over the world. And I can't remember how many different countries, but there's a good chance that where you live, they might actually have some sort of work health and safety legislation that talks about psychosocial hazards. And it really does vary depending on the country or the jurisdiction where you're at. Here in Australia, for example, the psychosocial hazards in the workplace, they're addressed under the Work Health and Safety legislation, and specifically the Work Health and Safety Act. And each state and territory in Australia has its own work health and safety legislation that applies within its jurisdiction. Similarly, the Occupational Safety and Health Act, OSHA, addresses psychosocial hazards in the United States, and the Health and Safety at Work Act is the relevant legislation in the UK. And each province and territory in Canada, for example, have an Occupational Health and Safety Act too. The European Union, I guess, has one. It's the Framework Directive on Safety and Health at Work, and it provides a general framework for addressing psychosocial hazards. So if you live in the European Union, that would be the piece of legislation I would refer you to. It's really crucial that you consult the specific legislation applicable to where you live and the detailed information on the requirements and obligations related to psychosocial hazards in the workplace that you need to follow or abide by. And having that understanding, it will really help you navigate psychosocial hazards and their legal implementation. I can't even say that. Implications. There we go. To me, whenever you look at psychosocial hazards, you just look at those and say, well, if we had good leadership in the workplace, psychosocial hazards wouldn't be an issue. We wouldn't have challenges around psychosocial hazards affecting our work or our staff or our team if we had really good leadership. So as I kind of identify what these psychosocial hazards are, think about it in the context of leadership or being in a leadership role and how you can best demonstrate leadership to address these. First question, of course, what are psychosocial hazards? Psychosocial hazards, they typically arise or are related to the design or the management of work, the working environment itself, and workplace interactions and behaviors. And as we get into some of these, you'll see how they've actually been around for a very long time. And they can cause significant psychological and physical harm in the workplace. Of course, physical harm sometimes is very easy to identify. Psychological harm, sometimes it can be hidden in the workplace. We need to learn how to actually unpack that and uncover that. And of course, when staff are experiencing this, they're being impacted. Their mental health is being impacted, their emotional well-being. It all leads to various health issues. So a lot of times, psychological hazards that people are facing, they can start to manifest as physical manifestations in different diseases and impairments and things. So it's really important that we recognize the seriousness of some of these hazards, and then we take proactive measures to address them. Now, I'd like to give you a few examples of psychosocial hazards, and the majority of these are directly out of the Work Health and Safety Act here in Australia. So the first one is job demands. So if you have a job, high workloads, excessive time pressure, long working hours, conflicting demands, These all contribute to stress and burnout. And I'm going to do some episodes around burnout and how to identify that and what that is. Sometimes our work flows. We have down times whenever work is slow. We have up times when work is very demanding and can take a lot of our time and can be the excessive time pressure and that large amount of work, but how we actually stepping in whenever those do become too much and helping people out. Low job control, and this is around that lack of autonomy and decision-making authority within your role and control over the work processes that you are a part of. And this can actually lead to feelings of frustration and decreased job satisfaction. Now, I get that sometimes people that are very junior, very inexperienced, would probably be the better term to use, they're going to have low job control. They're not going to have that autonomy. Their decision-making authority is going to be very low, but we slowly have to build them up and teach them and get them that experience so that they can gain more autonomy, so they can start making better decisions and more decisions around their work and things like that. Another one is poor support. And so this is your inadequate support from supervisors, colleagues, the organization. You want people to feel like they're supported there. People there, they're there to do a job, and they want to feel like they're supported in their roles, that they can actually go out and do the job and that you have their back and that you're going to resource them as they need and things so that they're actually able to be successful in their role. Another one is lack of role clarity. So unclear job expectations, conflicting roles, ambiguous responsibilities. Those can cause confusion and frustration. And this one's a difficult one sometimes, particularly if you're in a very small organization and people may be working across multiple domains, or whenever you have a new role that take on certain tasks, but you're not quite sure what are the other tasks associated with. And I think the important thing there is to sit down and have a conversation with that person and say, look, there's going to be a lot of ambiguity in here, but help me take the ambiguity out and let's actually document what it is you're doing or what it is that we need you to do. And let's work on this together. And that goes back to that job control. So they have control over it, even though the ambiguity is there, but they can actually start to define and take that ambiguity away. Another one is poor organizational change management. That this can be inadequate consultation, just communication, and really getting tongue-tied today, communication across the organization and support during organizational change. And that can create a lot of anxiety and more resistance to the change that you're trying to achieve. So there you have to look at where is the resistance to the change at and decide how do we actually best address it. I'm probably going a bit too much in depth here in identifying how we can fix these because that's another topic here we're going to get into in a second. But the next one would be inadequate recognition and reward. And I've seen this in a lot of organizations where there's a lack of positive feedback or appreciation and really recognizing good work, or sometimes it seems like some people are being recognized and others aren't. And there may be views of favoritism there, or people just feel like they're being overlooked. And again, that impacts your motivation of your workforce and that job satisfaction. If people don't feel like they're appreciated or they're not getting actually recognized or rewarded for doing that, whatever it is they're doing. And another one is poor organizational justice. And I've seen this one time and time again, the inconsistent and unfair management decisions, the really lack of transparency, perceived injustice. Why are some people getting away, that resentment that's there? Some people, they can act up all the time and no one ever pulls them up. They're just allowed to go on. And typically when I see this, I hear managers and supervisors say, yeah, I knew they were acting bad. I knew they were bullying this person. I knew they were doing stuff wrong, but I couldn't address it because no one ever complained. And that comes back to the whole thing around having a duty to act whenever you see something, having a duty to actually intervene and do something on the behalf of others. I have another episode planned where I talk about what is a duty to act, because I hear so many people that do not act whenever they have a duty to act and they don't realize what is a duty to act. You do have a duty to actually make sure that justice is fair and it's consistent. The next one is traumatic events or material. And this could be, you have a workplace accident, violence, any kind of disturbing material that comes across. And I'll give you a couple of examples of this. In some workplaces, this could be incredibly difficult to manage, or something that you're going to put a lot of resource into and managing. If you look at people that work in your emergency departments, your police, your firefighters, your ambulance officers, anybody that might be exposed to these kind of things on a daily basis, it's really going to impact them, and you don't want to get them burnt out. And you don't want them to necessarily have long-term emotional distress or post-traumatic stress disorder. You want to really resource them well. But also too, a workplace accident where a staff member has been severely injured or even killed, I've seen that happen in a workplace, and the impact it has is just incredible. How deep it goes within the organization, and I don't care how big it is, it's going to hurt, and it's going to be something that you're really going to have to put a lot of resources to, and time, and communication, and patience, and really help people through. Another one is remote or isolated work, and I know that remote working has become a bigger thing, much bigger thing, particularly through COVID. But the socialization practices in the workplace are incredibly important for people's mental health. And that's why you see people now, they might have flexible work arrangements where they do spend a few days in the office. I've actually had staff that have asked me, look, can I come in the office a couple of days a week? I need that. I need to be around everybody else. Yes, let's do that. Because that's one of the ways that we're actually addressing that remote or isolated work. Some people love the remote work. It works really well for them, but the majority of people, they do need some interaction, but also too, some people, they want to be managed. They want to know that their supervisors there. They want to sit down and have a conversation with them and know that, they're being supported in that way. Isolated work too could be people working in isolated areas. I know, like here in Australia, particularly Tasmania, we have the Australian Antarctic Division. So they work down in Antarctica. That's very isolated work. So that's something, of course, that they're going to have to work at to address. Another one is a poor physical environment. So uncomfortable or unsafe physical working conditions. This could be looking at the makeup of your office. Is it worn down? Does it need a bit of a renovation? Poor lighting, inadequate ventilation. Are there lots of noises, or is it too quiet? Sometimes people don't like too quiet. All these things can cause stress. People like a really warm, welcoming environment that they're working in. It doesn't have to be brand new. It doesn't have to be top of the line, really expensive furniture and stuff. They want something that's clean, not cluttered, but they also don't want something that's broken down either. So you really need to work to identify and address these psychosocial hazards and create a safe and healthy work environment and promote the well-being of your team. And people might ask, well, how do we do this? So you might actually ask, how do we assess the work environment for psychosocial hazards? And to assess those psychosocial hazards, I'll give you kind of a quick rundown. I wouldn't say a quick rundown. It's like 30 different key things to look at, which might sound like a lot, but some of them, they're kind of related. So as you're checking out others, you might actually notice these others. So the first one, of course, is job characteristics and design. Review the type of work people are doing, review the demands and the task involves and the workload and the scheduling. And sometimes you might find it's not that the job demands are too much. They might not be enough. I've actually seen that before too, where people, they had low job satisfaction because they didn't find their role demanding enough. And you have to have that conversation. Well, what types of demands or what type of workload would you like to see? You have to find that balance. It's a very, very, I guess, precarious balance that you have to find between too much and too little, but you need to work with your team to identify what that is. Another one is systems of work. Sometimes your rules and your policies and your procedures and work practices, they actually are inefficient and they keep people from achieving their job outcomes. And I'll give you an example. I worked with one organization and they were using these industry standard KPIs, so the key performance indicators, and they weren't achieving them. Very few people, it was like about 5% within the workforce were achieving their KPIs. So we actually went and said, well, the workforce, they're very smart, they're very capable, they've been trained to a high standard. Why aren't they achieving them? We found out the processes within the organization were inefficient. So we worked on improving efficiency within those processes. Whenever we did, it flipped those percentages on their head. 95% were now achieving their industry standard KPIs. And the amount of morale that went up and the amount of job satisfaction so that you're seeing within the team, it was incredible, the difference that made. So another one could be the work environment. I've already talked about this. It's going beyond your tables and chairs and things. It's design, it's layout, it's those environmental conditions. You might need to go through the office and do a complete renovation. Sometimes having one type of flooring through the whole office is something that makes people happy. I've been in offices where they have 6 different types of carpet and 3 different types of hardwood in a small area where they've just done little bits and pieces here and there. But people like that nice, welcoming work environment. And then also, your plants and structures and things like that people are working with. So your machinery, your equipment, all your tools, are they actually being well maintained so they're easy to use? Are they safe to use? That goes into a whole nother realm. But people like to have equipment that works and that they can actually use on the job, particularly if you have a lot of people that interact with equipment. Those workplace interactions and behaviors. This is another one. How do your workers interact with each other and others in the workplace, whether it's visitors in the workplace, consultants, contractors, whatever? What are those interactions like? If you're seeing a lot of standoffish behavior, a lot of negative comments, people getting in arguments all the time, there's something wrong there with your culture. You need to look at it and address it. Another area that you can look at is your training, your instruction, your supervision, and actually your provisions for training. How much you budgeting for your training? Are you actually reinvesting back in your staff to help them to be better at their job, to help them to be able to take on higher level tasks, operate at the top of the scope of whatever it is that they're doing? That is one way that we actually can reward staff, is through training. I've worked with organizations, though, where they see training has a negative and a punishment because you're being sent away because you're not doing things right. So they send you away to go training. And that is the complete opposite of what you want. I think I actually just talked about this in the last episode. You don't want people to think a training has a negative. Training is a positive. Training is a reward. Training is something that we do to reinvest back in our people. The next one is previous incidents and feedback. Typically, if you have a bad culture, you're actually going to see a high level of incidences, near misses, and how we actually receiving feedback and looking at the causes and the root causes of the incidences, and actually how we collecting feedback on those things, because people are either getting complacent or people are trying to rush, whatever it is. If we have a safety of culture, or excuse me, if we have a culture of safety, then we actually can reduce those incidences and those near misses, but we have to make sure that our culture is aligned with that. Reviewing relevant legislation and guidelines. Sometimes we can use compliance has an advantage, or compliance to make our organizations better. I don't necessarily say compliance. It can be challenging sometimes. You say, oh, that's not reasonable. That's not how we do things. But compliance is there for a reason. It's there to protect people. It's there to protect you as a leader. So we need to know, what are the requirements within the legislation, the regulations, codes of practice, whatever you operate under, understanding that, because usually those are based off best practices. So, and if we're following those, we're doing the right thing. A few other things that we could look into is worker complaints and investigations. If you have a number of complaints or investigations happening within the workplace, that can be seen as a bad thing or a good thing. This kind of has two sides to it. One, a lot of bad things are potentially happening. That's why you have all these complaints and investigations. But also, too, you could have changed the culture. Now people feel comfortable enough actually bringing them forward, so they're going to increase. So I've seen that happen before. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you're doing something bad, but we do need to make sure that we're addressing these. We're addressing them professionally and in a timely manner. Workplace inspections is another one. Again, some organizations, they have a workplace health and safety committee or some other body similar to that, where they actually meet with various workers across the organization. They talk about safety concerns. They talk about the psychosocial hazards and how they can best do them. They're also doing the workplace inspections, making sure we have a safe environment that we're working in. And then another one is staffing, resourcing, procurement. How are we actually making all those choices? How are we actually bringing people into the organization, inducting them into the organization, and how are we procuring services? So that's an important one too. Another one is our work systems, our policies, our procedures that we're using. Are they fair and equitable? Is anybody disadvantaged because of these policies and procedures that we looked into? Sometimes there's secondary or even tertiary effects that fall out of some policies and procedures that we implement. So we actually have to be aware of that. Whenever we do implement new policies and procedures, make sure that the secondary and tertiary effects are positive and not negative. Duty statements and performance agreements is another area. And sometimes you might hear them called position descriptions. Those are funny. So you don't want them to be prescriptive, but more descriptive of what a job or what's related to a job. And you need to have this conversation again. Not everything you do is going to be within this job description. And I actually did an episode about, quit saying that's not my job. And I've heard people say, well, I'm not going to do that. It's not my position description. Okay, well, we need you to do these things, but let's talk about it, and it's actually come to an agreement on how we can best address this. Records of hours worked. A lot of people that are paid hourly, of course, they're going to have a record of their time worked, whether it be a timesheet or whatever you use. And if you see actually people are consistently working long hours, day after day, week after week, far beyond what is reasonable, and what is reasonable, that's a bit subjective, but we can look at that and say, well, this person, they're working a lot of long hours. Let's find out why. Do they need more resources to reduce their time? Is their work demand too high? Are they inefficient in their work methods? Have we actually put them into an inefficient system or an inefficient process that they're a part of? So make sure you're reviewing the work hours that people are doing. Absenteeism and turnover data and exit interviews. I find exit interviews to be very useful in absenteeism. So as soon as people are accruing sick leave, are they taking that sick leave, or do they actually have a lot of sick leave banked up? Those tell you two different types of things. Turnover data, your attrition rate or retention rate. How long have people been with the organization? How many How many people do you lose each year? So what percentage of the workforce actually turns over each year? Look at your industry. There's potentially some industry data around there, and benchmark your organization based off this industry data. And whenever people do leave, do exit interviews. Find out why they're leaving. Are the majority leaving because, oh, look, you've invested in me so much here. I've outgrown my role and I've gone to another organization to keep moving up the chain because I can't do that here. Not necessarily a bad thing, but something we need to think about. Or is it, I'm leaving because of this person? I wasn't treated right by this person. I didn't like how this was going. Because remember, people leave people, they don't leave organizations. So doing those exit interviews, and sometimes, best practice is let them leave, give them a couple weeks, and then have someone from HR, independent person, contact them and actually ask them to do an exit interview. Work health and safety committees, I mentioned that just a minute ago. What are they doing? How are they interacting with the organization? How are they looking after safety and people's mental health within the organization? And really take whatever recommendations they give to you as management, take those seriously and actually make sure you're implementing those recommendations too. One of the big things too is employee feedback and complaints. But if your culture of the organization, if people don't feel like that they can actually come forward and give feedback and make complaints, then it's not going to happen. So if you don't have trust within your organization and it's a bad culture, you're not going to get this. But if the culture is strong, you're going to get this. And again, whenever people do give you feedback and complaints, make sure you acknowledge it in a professional way and make sure you're taking it on board and making sure you're doing whatever needs to be done to address those things. This is one I kind of mentioned before around that duty to act, but work environment observations. What are you seeing in the workplace when you watch people interact? When you see people during their day, what's their demeanor like? What's happening? When you make these observations, sometimes you're going to see things that you might have a duty to act on. You're going to have to intervene on somebody's behalf. It doesn't mean that they have to come make a complaint to you before you do something. That's really that standoffish. That's kind of that's not my job type mentality. So if you're at the top of the organization, your job is to look after everybody there. Your job is to make sure you have a strong, positive culture, and your job is to make sure that everybody leaves every day and they go home and everybody is doing well. Another one could be worker vulnerability. And this is probably more around if someone is vulnerable to being exploited. That's a big one. Do you have people, like I've worked in organizations, we have people that were political refugees. And I can tell you the amount of people that try to take advantage of them, not necessarily in the workplace, but just in the everyday environment, it's quite high. And it's disgusting too. Is it potentially somebody, the big thing right now is around violence against women. If you have women in your organization, they might be experiencing violence at home or in a domestic violence situation. So we actually have responsibilities within the workplace, and there's been a few changes within the Sexual Discrimination Act to address this that we actually need to take into account and we actually need to take action on. So again, you have a duty to act if you see someone that's being taken advantage of or someone that is potentially being abused in their relationships. By reviewing all these sources of information, so policies, procedures, legislation, our own observations, feedback, you can understand how the psychological hazards, how the psychosocial hazards represent in the workplace, and then develop some appropriate control measures to mitigate these risks. If you don't feel comfortable in doing that, there's probably an organization where you live that you can contact to help with it. And if you're still not sure, or potentially if you're limited by a budget, for example, there's professional bodies that put out a lot of information on this. I know the Australian Human Resources Institute here in Australia, they put out a lot of information on this and actually how you can identify psychosocial hazards in the workplace, how you can prevent them, and actions you can take and make sure that they don't actually happen. So one of the things that the legislation looks at, though, in some of the wording, it's around whenever you take steps, what's reasonably practicable. What is that? What does reasonably practicable mean? Whenever you look at psychosocial hazards or anything, several factors should be considered when determining what's reasonably practicable. And whenever you look, it's almost like doing a risk assessment. So they include the severity and the likelihood of harm, available knowledge and information, technological feasibility. So if it's not feasible, this may potentially come around remote working. If it's not technologically feasible for your organization to do it, then it might not be able to happen. Financial implications, if some of the measures that you want to implement or that you need to implement to reduce some of these psychosocial hazards is too expensive for the organization to afford, then that's reasonably practicable that you didn't. operational and practical considerations. Sometimes work health and safety, we take on a certain level of risk whenever people are doing certain types of work. And going back to my comments around police officers, firefighters, maybe some of your ambulance officers, but really your police officers and firefighters, your police officers, there is going to be a time where they're going to deal with people that can be quite violent. Firefighters go into situations, into environments that are quite volatile. You actually can't remove all the danger, but you make sure that they're trained, make sure they have the appropriate resources and tools in order to address whatever the environment, whatever the situation is. And as long as you can show that you've done everything you can, then you've done what is reasonably practicable. Other resources and expertise is another way, like I mentioned just a minute ago, actually going out and engaging another firm that specializes in the area that you need to address. That's one way you can do it. Compliance with legal requirements. So that can vary, and you really need to maybe even talk to a solicitor to make sure that you are complying with some of these. Consultation and engagement is another thing too. So if you don't take on board, for example, recommendations from your work health and safety committee, if you're not actually consulting with your workforce, doing surveys, getting feedback, then they're going to say that's probably not reasonably practical, that you didn't know. And then, of course, feasibility of implementation. How feasible is it for your organization to implement some of these? Sometimes it may be difficult. And going back to that ambiguity comment, a small organization, particularly a startup, for example, if you're an employee in a startup, you need to be someone who probably deals with ambiguity a lot, because that organization is still defining what it is they do and how they're doing it. And so you might actually have to build that in. Regardless of what you do, it's just important to balance risk reduction and the practicality of implementation, really to create a safe and healthy work environment. Because at the end of the day, as leaders, we want our people to come to work and want to be there. Whenever people are there, we want them to be treated well, be treated with respect. We want them to be safe, and that whenever they go home at the end of the day, they're satisfied that they've achieved something. They've satisfied that they've been able to give to the organization and commit to the organization. And they go home, they're actually not stressed to the point that they're bringing home all that stress and that mental distress to their family or to whatever environment they're going in there. You hear a lot of people talk about you need to have work-life balance. Well, do you have to find balance throughout your whole life? And it's not that you have the work on one end of a seesaw and their personal life on the other end of a seesaw and they go up and down. Well, one really does affect the other. If they have a bad home life, or things are going really bad in their personal life, it's going to come in their work environment. And we need to understand this, and we actually be able to help them the best we can to address these things. And vice versa, if the work environment is poor and they're not treated well and they're faced with conflict all the time in their work environment, they're going to take that home with them. So we just need to make sure, at least when they're at work, they're being supportive. And sometimes we need to give them tools to be able to support themselves in their personal life too. Anyway, that's my thoughts on this subject. What are your thoughts? I'd like to hear them. Feel free to reach out to me at blakerepine@gmail.com, or look me up on LinkedIn. Just search my name, Blake Repine. I've had a number of people contact me through LinkedIn lately, and I really do appreciate it. And just I continue to encourage you to please reach out. If there's any question you want to ask, any topic you'd like me to cover, quite happy to have a conversation about it. Because again, one of the biggest things as leaders is that we share knowledge and we work to develop each other. Thank you very much. Talk to you again soon.